The story behind Nicolás Maduro, power, oil, and the shadows of global politics. Let me tell you something. In global politics, nothing ever happens suddenly. When you hear news that sounds shocking, a president captured, a government collapsing, a foreign power stepping in, it is never an accident. It is always the final chapter of a very long story that most people never paid attention to. For years, Venezuela has been sitting on something the world has always wanted: oil. Not just oil, but one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. And history teaches us something very uncomfortable. Countries that sit on massive resources rarely get to live quietly. Maduro did not come from wealth or power. He came from the streets, from labor unions, from the political movement built by Hugo Chavez. Chavez changed Venezuela by nationalizing oil, pushing back against Western influence, and saying openly, "Our resources belong to us." That message made him popular at home and dangerous abroad. When Chavez died, Maduro inherited more than a presidency. He inherited enemies. At first, the world watched quietly. But as Venezuela's economy collapsed, inflation exploding, food shortages growing, people leaving the country by the millions, the narrative slowly changed. Maduro was no longer described as a leader with a different ideology. He was now framed as a dictator, a criminal, a threat. And here is where the deeper story begins. When the United States imposed sanctions on Venezuela, the official reason was democracy and human rights. But sanctions didn't just punish politicians. They stringled the oil industry, blocked access to global markets, and made Venezuela desperate for allies. That desperation pushed Maduro toward China and Russia. China didn't come with speeches about democracy. It came with loans, infrastructure deals, and oil forward agreements. Russia came with weapons, military advisors, and strategic backing. To Washington, this was no longer just about Venezuela. It became about losing influence in its own hemisphere. In American strategic thinking, Latin America has always been considered a sphere of influence. Seeing Russian aircraft, Chinese investments, and Iranian cooperation appearing in Venezuela set off alarm bells. So the story shifted again. Suddenly, Maduro wasn't just a bad leader. He was accused of being part of international crime networks, drug trafficking, and terrorism financing. Whether all accusations were true or politically amplified is something historians will debate for decades. But what matters is this. Once a leader is framed as a criminal instead of a political opponent, international law becomes easier to bend. And that brings us to the dramatic claims about his capture. When reports emerged that Maduro had been seized and taken into US custody, the world reacted not just with shock, but with fear. Because this wasn't a drone strike, it wasn't sanctions, it wasn't diplomatic pressure. It was direct action against a sitting head of state. Many people immediately asked, is this legal? Is this a violation of sovereignty? Or is it enforcement of international justice? Europe's reaction was cautious. Some governments avoided strong language, calling for investigations, due process, and restraint. Others stayed silent, not necessarily because they approved, but because global power politics often forces allies to choose silence over honesty. At the United Nations, the situation exposed a familiar weakness. The Security Council, divided along geopolitical lines, struggled to speak with one voice. Some members condemned the action as a dangerous precedent. Others focused on the accusations against Maduro instead of the method used. And this is where history starts whispering to us. People remembered Saddam Hussein, once an ally, later an enemy, eventually removed. They remembered Iraq, where weapons of mass destruction were the justification, but oil and strategic dominance were the long-term reality. They remembered Syria, where regime change was discussed openly, but never fully executed because the risks were too high. So people began asking uncomfortable questions. Is Venezuela another chapter in the same book? Are resource-rich countries destined to become battlegrounds for global power? Is this about justice or control? Then comes the Trump factor. Trump's political philosophy has always been blunt. America first. Not hidden, not soft. In that worldview, global politics is not about balance, it's about leverage. Resources matter. Energy matters. Influence matters. Iran, for example, has long been on Washington's radar. Sanctions, pressure campaigns, threats of regime collapse, all justified under security concerns. Yet beneath those concerns lies another truth. Iran controls strategic routes, energy flows, and regional power. So, when people connect Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Libya, they're not imagining patterns out of thin air. They're noticing something history has shown before. Where resources and resistance meet, pressure follows. This is why countries like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and others rich in oil or minerals watch these events closely. Not because invasion is inevitable, but because influence is always negotiated through power, not morality. Does this mean the world is heading toward a third world war? Not necessarily in the traditional sense, tanks and trenches everywhere. But we may already be living in a different kind of war. Economic pressure, cyber operations, proxy conflicts, regime manipulation, and selective enforcement of international law. The capture of a president, if normalized, changes the rules of the game. It sends a message not just to enemies, but to allies as well. The message is simple and terrifying. Power decides what is legal. And now, the story pauses. Maduro's fate is uncertain. Venezuela's future is unclear. Global alliances are shifting quietly, and ordinary people, as always, will carry the heaviest burden of decisions made far above them. So the real question is not just what happened to Nicolás Maduro. The real question is, who might be next? Which country is watching this story and seeing itself in the mirror? And how far is the world willing to go before the cost becomes irreversible? Because history doesn't end with one capture. It only asks us, what comes next? So history doesn't end here. It never does. What we've talked about today is only the surface, the first layer of a much deeper story. Because behind what you see on the news, there are decisions being made quietly, alliances shifting in silence, and consequences that will not show themselves immediately. What comes next is not just about one man or one country. It's about power, resources, and how far the world is willing to go to protect its interests. And that's why this story doesn't end today. This was part 1. In the next part, we will go deeper into what happens after a leader is removed, how global powers react when the balance shifts, and why some countries seem untouchable while others become targets. We will talk about who is watching closely, who is nervous, and who might already be preparing for what comes next. If you found this story thought-provoking, if it made you pause, if it made you question the world a little differently, then you already know why you shouldn't miss the next chapter. Take a moment to subscribe. Not because I asked, but because this story is far from over. And what's coming next is even more revealing. Thank you for listening. Stay curious. And I'll see you in part 2.